Well, hello, it's Charlie Pellerin back, continuing to narrate these Fifth Force slides, one of my favorite presentations. This is an image we used to use on the front of the slide deck. Now I've got a context image that makes more sense, but it's a great kind of vague way to talk about power and potency. Suggest that idea. So we have been measuring social contexts, or what the presence of the fifth force is, for many, many years. And some time ago we put these in a histogram and drew a curve. This is a whole mess of team social contexts. We call this the benchmarking scale. That just means we're going to compare teams across this spectrum. Teams with low benchmarks, teams in the bottom quintile, have explosions, failures like Hubble's, crashes of 747s, and crashes of subway trains in Tokyo. Teams with high context have good profits. You can read this story about profit and how NASA builds teams in the introduction. Also about this project called Stereo on page 54, and how NASA builds teams. I was speaking not long ago in China when I talked about the fact of using the context shifting worksheet to manage the context was the way to have a happy marriage. The Chinese people got very interested in this, and so I wrote up a section on this, and you can download it on our website in the 4D Users Guide, and it works. This all started when I was putting out my prospectus, trying to get an agent for my book, and two ladies called me and they said, "Charlie, you know, we don't do your kind of book, but we want to know, we're both married to engineers," two separate calls, "and how do you have a happy marriage?" And I said, "You manage the context." And so this is not just about technical projects. And I'll talk a little bit about the Hubble servicing mission and how it was put together with the green context. This is so important and so overlooked by almost everybody, this whole business of context. That some people are so busy believing the world's all technical, and the world simply is not. So in 1986, Challenger exploded, and people were waiting for me in the parking lot when I went to work that morning to tell me about it. And the reason was my division had a small, low-cost satellite in the cargo bay. And you know, the first thing, the way the mind works is when you hear about this kind of thing, you wonder whether our little cheap system somehow broke loose and went through the cargo bay doors of the shuttle and caused the death of these astronauts. Well, of course, nothing like that happened of the sort. We found out it was a problem in the solid rocket motors here. And I'm watching the failure review very carefully because of my personal involvement with this project. And a great hero of mine, Professor of Physics Richard Feynman, was on the board, and he's on television, and he takes and he dips his piece of rubber O-ring material from the booster into his ice water. It shows that it gets stiff, and I go, "Oh my word, it was a technical error. They just didn't understand the physics of that ring," and I quit watching. Well, that was a terrible mistake, because Diane Vaughan, a book I read much later, her picture is supposed to be there. It'll be there in the regular slides. For some reason, PowerPoint takes pictures out once in a while. She wrote a book about what happened, called the Challenger launch decision. And what she was talking about is, why did the people who were very experienced scientists, engineers, and managers on the launch management team, why did they choose to launch when all the data suggested otherwise? This is really fascinating, and we're going to be working more and more with the frailties of human perception. She said that what was happening was the fifth force that was in play was a pressure to launch, launch, launch. She called this phenomenon normalization of deviance. And normalization of deviance is when you alter your perception by some fifth force social context. And in their case, it required ever stronger technical argument to delay a launch than to proceed. And they drifted into what some call incremental stupidity, where the data, they required a much more compelling argument to delay a launch than to continue a launch. What a tragedy. And she goes on to say, "It's unfortunate these forces are invisible and unacknowledged." So In her book, she writes quite a bit about the fact that it's really bad news that this normalization of deviance or change in perception is the problem because nobody knows how to fix it. Well, I'm going to show you how to fix it. In today's language, what we would say is a flawed team social context put good people in a bad place. Now, unfortunately, I didn't really learn the lesson of this, and it might have been too late anyway, because in 1990, in my 8th year of leading the team that built Hubble Space Telescope, went to the launch and everything worked great. The shuttle performed perfectly well. The shuttle went up on orbit. All the systems on Hubble worked fine. We released it to space. I went back to work. Came back to monitor about 2 months later to watch some early images, and this is one of a nearby galaxy called M100, stands for Messier 100. A guy, Messier was a Frenchman who cataloged galaxies. And that's what we sort of expected we would see in a high-quality image from Hubble. That is a Hubble image taken after the repair, and that's what we saw. Oh my God, what happened? Well, I was put on the failure review board because the reasoning was the mirror was built in 1977. I wasn't on the program until 1982, so I could have had nothing to do with it. So the board of optical experts met for many months and could not figure out what the problem was. One guy finally said, let's see what would happen if this primary device they measured the mirror with when they manufactured it, called a null corrector, was misspaced by a humongous amount. Like he did a calculation for a millimeter, and that's gigantic in this business. Sure enough, he duplicated the error and found that this was the cause. We manufactured the mirror. It turned out the happy part was it was manufactured perfectly to the wrong spec, which meant you might be able to do something about it. So the head of the failure review board, General Lou Allen, wanted to understand why the smart people at PerkinElmer didn't do anything about all the dozens and dozens of tests made with other devices that were believed to be less accurate, but showed hints of a problem. And what he found was that they were so beaten down by NASA, me and others, it was the way we managed in those days, because they're constantly overrunning. And so Hubble started off with a budget of $400 million, ended up at $1.7 billion. And so you can imagine all the stress and trauma in Washington of getting the money over and over from the Congress and the administration. And so you look around to see whose fault it is, and of course it always looks like it's the people doing the work. So they rationalized the test results. You can read my book for more details on how this happened. And so I thought, well, that's the end of that. Well, then General Lou Allen, asked another question. He said, I know that NASA had really smart scientists on the science working group. Why didn't they find this error? They knew better. They knew this kind of thing could happen. And he found out then the contractor never told us. Well, interesting conclusion he drew. But rather than making the contractor wrong, he's a contractor himself at managing JPL. He said NASA created an environment so hostile that they wouldn't tell any news that wasn't absolutely thought to be a terrible problem, and they had so many other problems they didn't think this possibly could be one. So he said the root cause was a leadership failure, and I was the leader of the Hubble team. Today, we would have used the word team social context. The interesting thing was nobody ever blamed me for this, despite what he said, because no one believed that social factors, excuse me, could be important in project management. I know that sounds crazy, but that's how technical people think. So another case that I find just absolutely fascinating is that Korean Airlines was crashing at 17 times the normal rate. And what fascinated me was this went on for 4 years. We're not talking about little planes. We're talking about 747s crashing. And what erroneous assumption do you think they made that caused them to not find the real problem? Let's go back to Challenger and look at how people thought about the technical capabilities and management capabilities of the people managing the solid rocket boosters. You think those were good managers? First rate, absolutely first rate. Let's go back to the people that worked on Hubble. What kind of scientists, engineers, and managers do you think were attracted to work on Hubble worldwide? The best in the world. So what the error that everybody makes is they believe that success is all about individual abilities. That's why we all spend so much time studying, going to school, taking examinations, and nobody thinks much about social context. Well, they took the Korean Airlines pilots and put them in simulators, and that's one of the jobs that you can quite easily really test someone's abilities. So you can put them in a simulator, and you can simulate a 747 with 2 engines out, landing on a foggy runway with a 20-knot tailwind and ice on the runway, and see if they can land the airplane. And they found that these people were as good a pilot as anybody. So can you imagine what the real reason was? It was social context. Finally, after 4 years, a company called Alaton put some observers in the cockpits to watch what happened. And what they saw, that when the captain was flying the airplane and making small mistakes, the first officer wouldn't say anything. They had brought in the Confucianism of their culture into the cockpit. And in the Confucian society, you respect elders to the point that's not proper to criticize them. So the worse the captain pilot was, the more the second officer ignored what was going on, in some cases reading a magazine. Now, I fly a lot in big jets, and I go up to the cockpit and talk to the crew, and when you come in there, they're friendly, they're warm, they're welcoming. Oftentimes they'll let me sit in the pilot's seat and pretend I'm flying the airplane for a couple of pictures, because they're now trained to be colleagues working together in the cockpit. So what happened with the case of Korean Airlines is that the Alaton was pondering, how can we get the Korean culture out? You can't, they're not going to hire non-Koreans to fly their airplanes. That would be insulting. So what they said was, we're going to ask you only permit people to speak English in the cockpit. So by having them speak English, they removed them largely from their Korean thinking, and they also taught them interpersonal abilities, and within a few months, the flight rates were back at the same level they were for all the other airlines. You can see tons of these. This is just kind of fun. An old experiment in the 50s where you were shown a card, and you were asked which line is closest in length to it with another card. Now, you didn't know this, but 7 plants were in front of you and gave the same wrong answer. So let's say you can look at this, and even a child could see C is the right answer. When 7 other people said B, 1/3 of us gave the wrong answer. Now, what's really interesting about this one is that I studied this a long time ago, and I thought what was happening here is that you'd be sitting here and you'd say, well, I know C is the right answer, but I'm going to say B just to fit in. When they did MRI studies of people doing this work, they found that these people, based on their brain activity, were giving what they thought was the right answer. Back to our old friend perception. Worst crash in aviation history, Tenerife Island. Big jets were diverted from Madrid because of a bomb scare to a small island. KLM's jet was driven by their superhero, Captain Van Zanten, the poster child of KLM, the head of all training. He wants to get home. They're sitting on the runway in the fog. A garbled radio communication comes through. He spools up the engines for takeoff. His co-pilot says, I'm sorry, Captain, I didn't hear a takeoff clearance in that. The great Van Zanten kind of glares at him, throttles back down. Second garbled call. Van Zanten pushes the throttles up again. The embarrassed second officer doesn't say anything, and they go down the runway and slam into a Pan Am 747 still on the ground. Tokyo train system. 1/2 of Tokyo rides the train on a weekday. And the Japanese, as you know, are very rigorous about how things are done. So there's a train driver who made a mistake and has to go back to what's called school, remedial school. And remedial school in Japan is punishing. So what you do is for 3 months you go out there and sand track by hand. It's not remedial at all, but that's the nature of parts of the society. He gets back in the train. He's driving again, comes into a station, and he overshoots it by 100 meters. Well, he waits because it's the guy on the other end of the train, the conductor, who's supposed to report these things. He calls him on the radio and says, please don't tell him I'll be back in that school. So the conductor thinks for a minute, and he reports that he only overshot by 8 meters, which is not a big deal. The guy backs the train up, and people get on and off. Now he's 1 minute and 46 seconds late. Now, there's tons of these trains running everywhere, and people are interconnecting on them, and that's a big problem. That means people are going to miss connections. So he comes out of the station, he puts up to 120 kilometers, which is maximum speed the train will go, trying to make up time, because the next station has lots of people that only have 30 seconds to change. He comes into a sharp curve, and the speed limit on the sign is 70 kilometers. He realizes he's got to slow down, and so he hits the service brake, but he also realizes that the only thing that's going to get the train stopped really quickly is the emergency brake, and if you hit the emergency brake, you go back to the school. So he didn't use the only brake that would have worked, tried to get his way through it, and killed 106 people. I don't care how good a driver you are, if you text while you're driving, something like this is inevitable. This is an early and very important book in this subject for me, Training Ain't Performance. He shows research data that context drives performance over 70% of the time, not individual abilities. And Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, he inventories the richest, 75 richest people in all history. In every single one, the context was what made them wealthy, not who they were as individuals. So I went and put the mission to fix Hubble together covertly, secretly, and you can read about that in the book too. And people sometimes say, well, Charlie, that's a great, courageous thing you did. No, it's just, I think much more like this. There are no great men, just great challenges that ordinary men out of necessity are forced by circumstances to meet. Now, by now, I'm starting to get some vague understanding of the power of context. I'm looking at what happened to Challenger. I'm looking at what happened to Hubble. And I ask myself, why did I allow the Hubble team to function the way it did? Well, there are 3 reasons. One is, when I joined the program, it was in its 5th year already and pretty well set in how it operated. The second one was all the modeling by my top management, even the administrator, was that you go and beat up on contractors to make them perform better. And third, I didn't have a lot of experience. I'd never run a billion-dollar program before. So when I put the servicing mission together, and like I say, I did it covertly so I could do it however I wanted, I kind of, just because I was reading about these things, used appreciation, 100% commitment, proper inclusion, and clear accountability to build that team right from the get-go, and it stayed that way. And despite being a much harder mission than the original Hubble, because we got all these problems with the astronauts doing things, is much more difficult than building the telescope. It was completely successful, and Hubble now, unbelievable to all of us who are back in the hard days, is in its 20th year of operation with more than 10,000 publications. Context matters. So let's begin to take a look at how we can manage it. See you in a few minutes. Take care, and thank you for listening.